How's everybody doing today?
Good, thank you.
Pretty well.
Excellent. I always feel like the webinar goes better when it's interactive, when people interrupt me and ask questions or type questions into the chat. So even though it makes the flow of the webinar a little rougher, I think you end up with better information and a better webinar overall if you interrupt. So consider this an invitation to interrupt me as we go with questions. All right, let's get started. Okay, this is an introduction to Transana. And so I'm going to cover the broad functioning of the program relatively quickly. This is one of those topics I could talk about for 4 hours if we had the time, but nobody wants to sit in on a webinar that long. So I'm going to try and put a lot of information into the next hour. I'm going to start with how to bring data into Transana, because that's always a good place to start. I'm going to talk about assigning meaning to portions of analytic data as an important step in making sense of them, then making sense of the data that one has coded or categorized, kind of the bigger picture, figuring out what it all means when you've coded a bunch of data or made a bunch of clips and quotes and snapshots and selections in collections, how to move from playing with data to writing up your results in an article or a book chapter or dissertation or whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. And there are a number of tools in Transana that can assist with the writing up process, with the data assembly process where you're making sense out of the data in the bigger picture, all of that kind of fun stuff. So let's do a quick introduction to the basics of Transana to start with. Transana works with text data, still image data, PDFs, and media data. I'm going to be demonstrating today with video data. First off, it's sort of the most complex kind of data. If you know how to work with video in Transana, you can pretty easily figure out working with the rest. But second off, I think that's where Transana really shines. Transana was specifically developed to address what was missing in other qualitative tools when I started this project 25 years ago, which was the ability to work with media data. I think media data is a really rich and important kind of data. It's a really great tool for collecting information for research. It is underutilized, and there's a lot that one can do with video that that Transana tries to empower. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today. So I'm going to start just by loading some sample data.
This is the core they started with, and they want it to look like that. I'm going to first flip it up. Watch what happens. Okay? Now I'm going to go back to where we started.
So this is a third grade teacher in Wisconsin doing a mathematics lesson. She's teaching geometric concepts using quilting exercises as part of a larger lesson unit that was being designed. And the research purpose behind this video was to assess that proposed curriculum, to look for ways of strengthening it, to see what worked and what didn't work. And they had very open permissions with the video. The researcher was very kind to give me permission to use this video in all of Transana's training materials and those kinds of things. So you can see in the upper right-hand corner, we have the media window that shows video when you're working with video data. If you have audio only data, this window shrinks up, but still includes the controller bar that you need to go through audio data. With other kinds of data, you don't really use that window. In the Lower left corner, you see the document window. This is where Transana shows text. If you're working with text only data, Transana displays that in the document window. If you're working with media, one option that you have is to create transcripts that correspond with the video. You noticed as the video was playing, there was a highlight in the transcript that moved along with that highlighted the portion that was being displayed at any given time. And so the document window shows transcripts as well. You can work with media files without a transcript in Transana if that's what your particular research need is. But in the opposite direction, you can also create multiple transcripts to describe multiple layers of what's going on in your data to do very detailed, subtle, and complex analyses. You can also work with multiple simultaneous media files. So if you go into an environment with 2 or 3 or 4 cameras, you can display all of those cameras in a synchronized view and work with that as a single coherent data set. So Transana has a lot more power than we're going to have time to touch on during this introduction webinar. Above the document window, you see the visualization window. You can see that it shows a waveform diagram, which displays visual information about the audio track of media data. You can also see that it shows coding. It shows you where I have coded and what codes I have added for this particular media file. And you'll see that as I mouse over the bars, Transana tells me what codes each of those colors represents. And that is then displayed across the timeline of the media file. If you're working with text-only data, then the visualization shows coding across the length of the text document. Just real quickly, if you have PDFs, Transana now works with PDFs. It allows you to use coding shapes as a way of coding PDFs so that you can both capture text data and analyze that text, but also to analyze and code visual aspects of a PDF, because there's more to a PDF than just the text it presents. So PDFs are a more complex data format, and Transana allows you some more complex tools for analyzing PDFs. Transana works with still images as well. I'll just pull up one of my favorite examples. Here's a piece of statuary from the British Museum. I thought it was particularly interesting that, in fact, this mythical creature had 5 legs, with the dual representation shown with the red dashed lines, and the more traditional single representation shown with the green solid lines to represent that coding difference, to in essence draw the researcher's attention to what is analytically important about this particular view of this particular still image. So Transana works with lots of different data types and has ways of addressing the different needs of different types of data, because different kinds of data actually do work best with slightly different tools. And then the lower right-hand corner of the main window is Transana's data window. And this is where you do a lot of your work with data. You bring new data into the data window. You use the data window, as you've probably seen, to make selections to let Transana know which piece of data you want to work with. Transana organizes all of your data. You create your coding scheme. You identify the selections that are analytically interesting in the data window. It shows what you've coded, it shows what you've categorized, and allows you to do a lot of analytic work. You call up most of Transana's reports from this window. So the data window is what allows you to organize and manipulate your data and perform a lot of analytic tasks. So that's a really quick overview of Transana's main windows. I'm going to clear the screen out. And so let's talk now about bringing data into Transana. if you're new to Transana, how do I start working with data? And again, I'm going to show video. The idea being that if you know how to do video, you can really easily figure out the less complex forms of data. So you see in the data window, which is where we start when we're bringing in data, that there are four branches to the tree here that are always displayed. Libraries are where we bring raw data into Transana. So when we're bringing new data in, we create a library, we put that new data in the library. A library is just a way of organizing your data. If you're on a small project that just has a little bit of data, you probably only need one library, but Transana is designed to be able to handle projects with thousands of pieces of data. I'm just finishing up with a project where we have something on the order of 1,600 videos taken over the course of about 5 years. And it's a huge analysis, and libraries are really essential in organizing that much data and making it so that you can find what you're looking for. Collections are where we work with data that has been identified as being analytically interesting. So in qualitative analysis, you start with a piece of raw data, you identify a portion of that data that's analytically interesting. There are a couple of different techniques for identifying what is analytically interesting about a particular selection in the data. And so Transana uses collections to hold those interesting bits of data, to organize those interesting bits of data, to separate them from the source data, because what you're analytically interested in works a little differently than what you start with in raw data. Keywords are where one develops a coding scheme. And so it's actually a number of coding schemes. I have a large collection of different projects all in this data set so that I can demonstrate different aspects of the program, so that I can answer questions that sometimes come up. And so the keywords allows you to develop an extensive coding scheme to apply to your data. And then search, as you might guess, is your access to the search tool that allows you to, is one of the tools for making sense out of coded data as you go. So to bring data in, the first thing we're going to do is to create a library. So we're going to go to the library node. I'm going to right click that and I'm going to choose add library. And so I'm just going to call this the webinar demo library. It's the library where I'm doing my demonstration for the webinar. That makes it really easy to delete and reuse this data set for future webinars. And you can see that now in my list of libraries, I have something called webinar demo. I'm now going to right click that, and you see I get a whole host of options. I can add text or PDF data, add episodes for media files. I can import spreadsheet data. So if I've used an online survey tool that has open-ended questions, I can pull that into Transana and do a qualitative analysis of that online survey data. And you see a whole host of other options as well. I want to bring in a video file, so I'm going to choose add episode here. Transana gives me my add episode form. I'm going to go out to my hard drive. I'm going to select my demo file for that. And my demo file is a math lesson about quilting and symmetry. So I'm just going to apply a code to my whole episode as I bring it in. That code that I apply at the level of bringing data in is something that will get suggested for all of the selections I make from this piece of data, so that I can use this to differentiate this from other lesson plans that I might be studying, or other types of data or other topics that I might be studying. So you can identify features that you want to have included in all of the selections you make from a piece of data by coding at this level. So I'm going to add that. We now see that I have an item in my library called demo. And now Transana is offering me the opportunity to create a transcript. As I've said, you don't have to create a transcript. There are lots of types of analysis one might do where a transcript isn't really useful or required. You might be analyzing dance, for example, or musical composition, where transcript doesn't quite make sense. But for a lot of work, having transcripts is a very useful tool. I want to emphasize, though, a transcript does not replace your media data. When you're doing analysis in Transana, you are analyzing the media data, not the transcript. I read articles for lit reviews, and I see article after article that says we recorded interviews and we created transcripts and we analyzed the transcripts, throwing away the media data. And I just think that's tragic, because there is a lot of meaning that can be pulled from listening to the media file that you're not going to get out of a transcript. There's emotion, there's sarcasm, there's, if you're using video, there can be gesture and facial expression that help you interpret what is being said, that help you go to a deeper level of meaning. And I've done a ton of work, obviously, analyzing video data, and I can't count the times where what I thought I saw in a transcript was changed when I watched the underlying video clip. So one of the things that is fundamental to the way I've built Transana is you're always just a click or two away from watching your video when you're working with video data, from listening to the audio when you're working with audio data, to get in touch with that source data so you can stay really close to your data through the whole analytic process. So I'm just going to call this automated transcript. And I'm going to come down here to the automated transcript method line here. If I want to, Transana has tools that allow us to use a company called Speechmatics. They have a very good quality, a very affordable automated transcription tool. So as long as you have IRB permission to put your data, share your data out to their server so that you can get those transcripts back. And they have good privacy policies, which you should read if this is something you're going to do, and talk that over with your IRB. But there is a tool for getting automated transcripts of your media files now built into Transana with the 5.0 release that came out less than 2 months ago. So I'm going to request an automated transcription be done here, and I'm going to submit that. Transana takes a moment, and I'm now in my automated transcription tool.
Yes, I know.
Yes? Is there a question? Okay, so I'm now, I've agreed to the terms. Transana strips the audio out of a video file to just submit that because it's more efficient use of bandwidth and takes less time. I was clearly doing something where I was working on Japanese data recently, but let's go ahead and specify that this data is in English. You see, I have the choice of US English, British English, Australian English. So they've really got a very nice tool. You can see that there are 48 languages supported by Speechmatics. There's an open question about how they deal with multilingual data. So I'm working with somebody who's got data that switches between English and Italian or English and Chinese. And when language switching is involved, Speechmatics says that they are working on it, and have suggested that there may be some things that one can do to improve that. So I'm trying to work with, I think, multiple languages and how one deals with automated transcription in data that has multiple languages in it. That's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. So I make the specification that tells their server about the data. I'm then going to submit that. I've actually already done this, so Transana is just hitting the data file that I created earlier. It's a fairly efficient process, though. It can create automated transcripts quite quickly. It submits the media file to their server. It pulls down their automated transcript data, and Transana then converts that into a form that shows up as a transcript in Transana. And you can see that part of what I've built into that, Speechmatics gives you, for each word in a transcript, what their level of confidence is in that speech recognition. And so you can see that I color code that in Transana. Words in red that have less confidence than green, which is less confident than blue, which is less confident than black. Now, I have found that a lot of the stuff that comes in red that has low confidence is perfectly accurate. A lot of the stuff that is in black, sometimes there are things that are just plain wrong. So I have not found automated transcription to be so good that I could just go and work with this data without checking it. So it's really important to be able to go through and check your data, correct the transcription as you go through. You can see these red marks here are time codes. That's what links the transcript and the media file. So I can go through, I can look at each section.
I think we have to test it on their.
I can.
Maybe. There, I'm gonna flip that one up and I'm gonna flip this one down.
So I can see the spots that it's not terribly confident. I can correct those, go through the whole process, fixing up the transcript so that it meets the needs that I have for research. Now, for a lot of projects, a rough transcript is good enough. You don't need it to be precise. You're just trying to get a sense of what's in the data so that you can decide what parts to look at in more detail. Other projects, they want to have everything just right. And so how much time it takes to correct a transcript really depends on your research needs, how accurate you need that transcript to be, as well as if there are nonverbal elements that you want to represent in the transcript that might be important depending upon what your research is like. But Transana can use automated transcription to at least give you a rough draft, a starting place on that transcription. And I found that that really does save a tremendous amount of time. It's one of those features that as soon as I've added it to Transana, I've been using it a lot, and it's really made a huge difference. So Transana offers that automated transcription, and it is a very useful tool. So I've now brought video in.
Maybe. There, I'm gonna flip that one up and I'm gonna flip this one down.
And we are ready to go with our analysis. Let's see. I talked about time codes. I talked about automated transcript. Does anybody have any questions about what I've shown so far? Does anybody want to see a demonstration of a different kind of data? Anything else before we move on to the next part of the webinar?
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, good. Thank you. So my question would be, what if a video has a lot of background noise? Is Transana still able to transcript the main dialogue with relative accuracy? Or, of course, I'd always need to text and correct, but still wondering what happens then.
I have been moderately impressed with Speechmatic's ability to pull speech away from background noise. It depends a little bit what that background noise is like. You know, if you have a situation where there's a fan or a noisy hallway or traffic noise outside a window or something like that, Speechmatic can filter that stuff out quite well. I've been really impressed with that. If you're doing a small group activity and you've got 4 different groups that are all talking at once and you're trying to focus on one group, but somebody in one of the other groups is pretty loud in things that are actually speech, then Speechmatics doesn't really have a way of knowing who's in the group you're focused on and who's in a group that you're not focused on. And so you get more interference that way. It really depends a lot on the specific video that you've got, what the nature of that background noise is, how good your audio quality is otherwise. I would say that the more background noise you have, the more important it is to go through that stage of correcting the automated transcript and making sure that it represents exactly what you want it to. And while the tool can filter out some of it, you probably want a human brain involved in filtering out some of it as well. So you might allocate a little bit of extra time for transcript correction if you have a lot of background noise of the type that would interfere. The other thing that I would suggest is Speechmatics does give you 4 hours of transcription for free. that is more than adequate to test a couple of files and see how well it's going to do. So you can give it a try and see what makes the most sense. If you if you find another tool that might handle that background noise better, you can still create transcripts in other tools and import them into Transana and link them to your video. For example, I know Otter AI is a very popular automated transcription tool. They don't offer the capacity for software to link in and make use of their tool and integrate the work that you do on that tool the way that Transana does with Speechmatics. But if that is a tool that gives you better results with whatever your data is, you can get your transcripts done on another service and import those as you're importing your other data, so that is an option as well. Like anything else, the better quality you have going into the process, the better quality the output is going to be. But I have been impressed at its ability to filter out stuff that isn't appropriate. It does not handle overlapping speech particularly well, but I find that human transcribers can have difficulty with that as well. So I don't really fault the system for not being able to sort that out quite as easily as one might like. Bottom line is that all artificial intelligence is still relatively in its infancy, and while it can do some things impressively, there's a lot that it just can't do yet.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay, I have two questions. Thank you so much. The first one is, anyone who uses Transana can use the transcription service. And the second question is, I have audio data and I have more than one participant. How the voice can be differentiated?
Okay.
Thank you.
To use Speechmatics, you do need an account with Speechmatics. They do charge for their services after that 4 hours per month. And so when we submitted that transcript, one of the elements in it was to pass in essentially my code that gave them my account information. So you do have to have an account with them to be able to use it. But
Okay.
you can get those accounts for free, and they charge. I think it's like a little over $1 an hour for automated transcription,
perfect.
something like that. So a very reasonable price. I was
Right.
looking at another service that charged 10 times that amount.
Yeah.
That
And
does,
I need to pay to you, or how you manage?
no,
the
your
payment?
account is directly with them. I'm just
Okay,
offering
okay.
the connection. I don't get paid for that. I'm not involved in that in any way, other than that my
Okay.
software gives
Okay.
you the ability to access their tool.
Okay.
And the second part of your question was about multiple speakers.
Yeah.
I have not found that their tool does anything about speaker identification or trying to differentiate the speakers. What it does, as you can see, is it basically gives you one sentence per line. And so you can go in and add those speaker identifiers as part of editing the transcript, as part of that pass I was talking about, and making sure that the transcript is accurate. You can add speaker identifiers really easily. Transana actually has a couple of different tools. It has autocomplete, so you could set up autocomplete tags, or you typed in initials and it expanded it to full speaker identifiers. It also has transcription shortcuts where you can define key combinations to represent certain kinds of text. That's what I use for speaker identifiers, is I'll define, Shift F1 and Shift F2 and Shift F3 as 3 different speaker identifiers, so that I can just use those key combinations to add the speaker identifiers as part of that reviewing of the transcript process.
Okay, I'm sorry because I was a little late. Coming back to the transcription service, when I introduce my data in the Transana, is when I need to pay or how is it?
When you are bringing data into Transana, you create an episode to represent each of your audio files, and then you
Yeah.
create a transcript to represent the transcription. When you're defining that transcript, you can select automated transcription as an option. You don't have to use automated transcription, but if you select automated transcription as you're defining the transcript, then as you submit that, you go on to a process that walks you through that automated transcription process. So there's a little bit about confidentiality. There's extracting the audio from a video file because it's more efficient that way. And then you get to the account information and settings
Oh, thank you.
And so here's where you specify what language your data is in. English and Chinese, you get to specify subtypes within that. You can do standard or enhanced transcription, enhanced being slightly more expensive, but maybe a little bit better at dealing with things like background noise. I haven't experimented with that much. I would encourage you to. And if you learn something interesting, please share it with me. And then this, what Speechmatics calls the API key is, that's my account with them. Because that's something that costs me money, it's done as a protected password rather than readable text. And so you have to have an account with them.
I need to have a previous account with them.
You need to have an account with them, and then they bill, or at least I believe they bill each month based on the amount of transcription that you've done with them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
And their website is speechmatics.com, which is where you go to set up the account.
Yeah, thank you.
So, any other questions before we move on? All right, let me go back in, and I'm actually going to load a different version of that data where I've already gone through and corrected the transcript because it's not very interesting. You know what? I lied to you. I'm not going to do that version because it's already coded, and I want to show you something that is not coded. So I'm just going to real quick add a transcript here, and I'm going to pull a version that I've already translated or already updated from the automated transcription. So now we have our media file, we have our transcript, and we are ready to go. So the next thing we want to do is identify the analytically interesting portions of the video, and we want to identify what is analytically interesting about them. Transana offers a couple of different systems for doing this that really meet different research needs. And so a lot of qualitative software give you one way of doing things. You do it that way. It's a little bit easier to learn, but it's not so flexible. Transana offers you a lot of different options for how you work with your data because different qualitative methodologies have different needs. I've worked with a lot of researchers over the last 20 years. Different researchers' brains just work in different ways. I can work with a research team that's all using the same methodology, talk to 3 different researchers, and they have slightly different ways that their brain works to implement that methodology. And then I find in my own work that when I'm approaching new data, I think about that data and I work with that data differently than in much later stages in the research where I'm tying things up, I'm adding my last little bits of data to make sure I've reached theoretical saturation, and I've got a good theory of what the data has to tell me, and I work differently at that point when I understand the data than at the beginning when I haven't figured out what the data has to say yet. And so Transana offers different methods to be flexible, to allow you to do your analytic work the way you need to or want to, and not be constrained by the way the program thinks you ought to do your work. And so I'm going to show you 2 different ways. I'm going to show you coding, and I'm going to show you categorization as the 2 most commonly used systems within Transana. Then you can sort of take a little bit of time to figure out which works best with your brain and your theoretical approach and your qualitative methodology and those kinds of things. So to start with coding, you create a coding system. You can always expand the coding system as you go. So here are my math concepts codes. This is a mathematics lesson that we're looking at and analyzing here. And so I'm going to pick a portion of my transcript. And because I'm working with transcripts, I make a highlight in the transcript, and Transana will use the section from the time code before my highlight to the time code after my highlight. So it uses those time codes that link the transcript to the media file to allow me to code a portion of the media file based on a transcript selection. So I'm making my selection here. I can right click that and it will play just this section to make sure that I've got it right. So this is about flipping. So I'm going to go to my flip code and I'm just going to double click that code. And you'll see up in the visualization window that suddenly I have two bars here that I didn't have before. The length of this bar represents this particular selection across the timeline of my media file. And these bars represent the lesson unit, which is the code that I put on this data when I pulled it into Transana. And then it's the code for flipping, which is the one that I just double clicked. So I was able to select a code, place that code on my selection in the transcript, and I'm now ready to move on. Let's say that I also want to indicate that that's geometry. So I want to apply my geometry code. I just double click that and it's now added to the same thing. I'm ready to go on, make my next selection. And so this is, again, it's flipping, but this is specifically up-down flipping, and it's still geometry. So just by double clicking those codes, make my selection in the transcript, and I double click those codes, and that creates for me a coded segment of my video that corresponds to this. So that's coding in Transana. It's really fast, it's really easy, and allows you to apply those codes and to get your data coded up. Now, under the hood, what that looks like is Transana actually creates a collection for all of this, and it automatically names it. So I'm going to pull up the second example there, and you see that what I have is the coding that I selected. I have just the portion of the transcript that I selected.
Yeah, so from now on, if someone's going to, if you want me to flip it up or down, what we call that is an up-down flip. We don't call it an up flip, we don't call it a down flip, we call it an up-down flip because that shows people we're talking to that we know. Doesn't matter if you flip it up or if you flip it down, you get the same result. So instead of...
So you see that the selection that I made roughly corresponds to what I had selected. Now, the mistake I made was I picked something that didn't have a time code right in front of it. So Transana looked for the previous time code, which was a little earlier than I anticipated. And it picked slightly more video than I wanted. I can always go back and correct that. So if I want to do that, I can come in here, I can...
Yeah, so from now on, if someone's going to, if you want me to that we know, doesn't matter if you down flip. We don't call it an up flip, we don't call it a down flip, we call it an up down flip. Down flip, we don't call it a down flip.
There we go. So I've now added my time code and I can remake that selection. And go in and delete the one that had the incorrect spot. And you can see by the coding now that it starts at a slightly different place. And when I load that new one,
we call it an up down flip because that shows people we're talking to that
we have that much better correspondence between what I selected and my media file. So I've been able to make a selection from my media file. adjust it to the size that I wanted, applied the coding that I wanted to that bit, and that gets stored as a series of automatically named clips within an automatically named collection to hold all of those bits that I did with coding. And so you can go through, you can code a tremendous amount of information, and there are a variety of reports and tools and the search engine that I'll show you in a little bit for pulling together that coded data, making sense out of it, and working from there. Now that's one approach to analysis, but there is, again, let me just go back to our source, and you notice that I'm able to take a particular quote that we're looking at, or a clip that we're looking at, and I can go back to my source, and Transana locates exactly the portion of the data that I was looking at. So I can go back at any time and look at the context of something that I've selected as analytically interesting. And I can't tell you how important that act is, to be able to go back and see what led up to a particular comment, what followed a particular comment, how that comment fits into the larger bit of my data collection, the context for that, so that I'm always just a click or two away from going back to my original video, listening to how things are said, seeing what was going on, making sense of it that way. So it's keeps me really close to my data at all times. So there's this alternate approach called categorization. And you can see that I have some named collections in my sample data set. And what you can do is you can create a collection as a place to put selections that you're making as you go. And that allows you to gather together things that are alike using categorization rather than coding. And the advantage of that approach is that it's really, really visual. It's so I was working on an ad campaign at one point, and I created a bunch of clips, and I looked through all of those clips, and I saw that there were two different things going on. I saw that there was logical argumentation in these ads, buy this product because it accomplishes this function and is worth your money to do that. But I also saw that there was a lot of what I termed emotional argumentation. All of the cool kids use this product. This product looks really, really good. Well, it was a tool, and how much do we care what the tool looks like on the outside, or are we more interested in the functionality of the tool on the inside? Or everybody uses this product, it's really, really popular, which is not necessarily a reason to buy it. Just because something is the most popular doesn't mean it's the best tool. And so there was emotional argumentation, there was logical argumentation. Then within each of those, I was able to break out a number of different logical arguments. I was able to break out a series of different tools used for emotional argumentation. And I created this increasingly nuanced understanding of the data, where my data selections represented support for the particular theoretical constructs that my collections represented. So it's a process of creating categories, moving your data between the categories, and having, having this very visual, concrete tool for looking at how your data comes across in the data. And so one of the things that I find myself doing a lot is when I'm in those final stages of writing, when I've got my my main themes laid out that I want to talk about, I will usually create a set of collections that reflect those major themes, sort my data that I've coded into those collections, and use categorization as a way of gathering together the final examples that support each of my themes. And I really use that during the writing up process to be able to pull the quotes that I want to include in my write-up, to be able to see which themes have tons of support and which themes maybe where the support is a little bit more sparse, and to understand portions of my data where it might cross the boundaries and be in multiple themes to really get a better understanding of that. So categorization is a different approach to data than coding, and it's a slightly different way of thinking about your data items as you go, or representing those data items, and it allows some slightly different ways of working with the data. And so you can do analyses entirely using coding, and they can be brilliant and accurate and write them up and publishable. You can do an entire analysis of the same data just using categorization, and you'll likely reach the same conclusions. It'll likely be equally brilliant and equally easy for writing things up. It's just a different way of representing the data. It's actually really easy to move between the two, to take something that you've coded and drop it into a category, to take something in a category and add codes to it, so that the tools that allow you to study coding are then available to what you have categorized. But my point is that Transana is a really flexible tool that gives you several different ways of accomplishing the same task, so that you can do it the way that works best for you in your analytics situation, and given the way your brain works and where you are in the analytic process. And it allows you to represent the data exactly the way you want to represent the data, as you're making sense out of it and as you're explaining to others what you have found in that data. So those are two of the major tools that allow you to manipulate data, make selections for what is analytically meaningful, identify what is analytically meaningful about those, and represent all of that. We're running a little bit late. We're not going to be done quite in an hour. Does anybody have a quick question or two about that analytic process that I've just demonstrated? Okay, so your next task then is making sense of all of that data that you have gathered together, making sense of all of those selections. I'm going to shrink the size of my media window here a little bit. And so what we're really talking about in terms of making sense out of data is Transana's reports and search tools. Transana offers a whole host of reports that allow you to make sense out of your data. So I can, for example, go to one of my collections, and I can ask for a collection report, and Transana will assemble that report. This is showing me all of the clips that are in this collection and all of its sub-collections. It's showing me the text, the transcript for each of those. It's showing me the coding on each of those. It's showing me the source of each of those. It's showing me where in my analysis each of those belongs. So it's giving me a ton of information about each of my clips. You'll notice that each clip is a hyperlink. So I can click each of these links. Transana will load that clip in the underlying main interface so that I can watch how this statement is said. I can see exactly the facial expression. I can see the gestures. I can hear the inflection. Connects me back to that media file at all times. So Transana gives me a very detailed report about all of the stuff that I've gathered together in a set of collections, so that I can make sense out of those collections. And it shows me down at the end what is the coding that's used across all of those, how many instances of each code, how much time in media files each of those codes covers, because that's a slightly different measure of use. So out of 47 items, we can see that 8 of them fall into this one particular coded pattern. I get a lovely little bar graph of my most commonly used codes. So Transana has text-based reports that allow me information. So that was a report about all of the stuff gathered together in a particular collection. That was everything gathered together with a particular common analytic meaning. But I can do that same report launched from a source document. And I can ask the question, where across all of my collections does a particular piece of source data get used? That's the episode report. It's a very similar looking report. It's got the same information, but this tells me from a single source, where did that get distributed across all of my analysis, so that I can look at the data from a very different angle using a very similar report. You can see that For example, some of the graphical coding that I did in this gets integrated into that report so that it can integrate lots of different kinds of data. And then the summary and the bar graph, again, show me all of that. Transana offers a variety of graphical reports as well. So I have some video gameplay data, for example, and I can run what's called a keyword map on that. This is showing me a map across the timeline of one of my videos of some of my coding categories. And when you look at this graph, you can see three very distinct phases of what was occurring across this video. You see phase one here for about the first 8 minutes where one kind of thing was happening. You see phase two here in the middle from about 8 minutes to about 13 minutes where a second kind of thing was happening. And then starting at about 13 and a half minutes, you see a third thing happening. So you can see those phases of what's going on in the gameplay really, really easily. Now, I could not see those by looking at the raw data. This is a particular arrangement of the coding that I did. So Transana actually gives you the capacity in all of the reports to customize those reports, to make them, to include or exclude particular parts of your data. So in this report, you can see that I selected just a subset of my codes. I carefully used colors to represent different things, and it allowed me to change the colors. It allowed me to change the order of how things were presented in this, because I can swap the order of these. So I was able to create a custom presentation of my data that helped me understand that data in a particular way. All of Transana's reports have that filter tool that allow you to work the data to include what's important and exclude what's not important, to make particular analytic points, to see things from a particular analytic viewpoint. So that's another part built into all of the reports. Another of Transana's reports, we have a series of presidential debates, and I created a collection where I looked at journalist behavior. I looked at what questions were asked during each of the presidential debates for 3 election cycles. And to summarize those questions, I decided to use the word frequency report. What are the words that journalists are using in the questions they ask of presidential candidates? And you can represent that as a word cloud. And there are, again, there's a whole host of options and ways that you can manipulate this to clarify and help you see the point. And so by doing a series of word clouds across 3 election cycles, I was able to see that in the first 2 election cycles I studied, questions were about policy. Questions were about decisions that a president would make. In the 3rd election cycle, the questions were much more about personality, and they were about gossip or media scandal or attempts at media scandal, so that there were not policy questions in this 3rd debate. I was able to demonstrate ways that the journalists were behaving very differently across these different election cycles that had a fairly significant impact on how the election went. And so there is a lot of that again is another way of representing your data, another of the reports. And Transana also has a search tool. So again, there are multiple ways of accessing the search depending on what it is you want to do. If I look at my math concepts, I know I have coded data about 3rd graders. What do 3rd graders know about the concept of pi? I have that code here. I can request a quick search. What Transana returns to me as the result of a search is, because it was video I was analyzing, it returns to me clips in collections. And I can, if I choose, there's a play all clips option. So I could have Transana play me these 6 clips. And what I would see is the definition of a task, students talking about what they find, students saying that the relationship between diameter and circumference of a circle is about 3, correcting themselves to it's about 3.1 to 3.2, and then presenting to the rest of the class that in fact, unless you screw up that relationship is exactly 3. So this tells the little story of what these students understand about the concept of pi based on a particular activity that they did in the classroom. Transana has a more complex search engine that allows me to look at particular collections, look at particular types of data, so that we can choose, for example, to look only at video clips and still images. It allows me to define which of my keywords, which of my codes have been applied. I can create complex relationships between those using the Boolean operators. I can also do search for text. I can type in a word or phrase, and Transana will look for data selections where that word or phrase was used. So there's a keyword search, but there's also text search built into all of this. And Transana, again, will return clips in collections that meet that criteria. There's also a matrix search where you can actually define a set of searches and compare the results of different searches to be able to understand your data even better. So there's a whole variety of tools designed to allow you to look at the analysis that you've done and make connections between different parts of the analysis based on your coding, based on your collections, based on your the inclusion of particular words and phrases, and make sense out of that. In addition, there are writing tools. So one of the things that I do as a standard process is I always create a library called research journals, where I create documents and do writing. I keep track of what is the progress, what have I done in a particular analysis on a daily basis. That's particularly useful on a large project where I've got a team of people using Transana's multi-user version, where we bring a team of people to work on the same data at the same time and achieve a conclusion. Everybody in my group is trained to record what did I work on a particular day, what did I find, what questions come up. Everybody reviews that log to see what happened since the last time they were on, respond to questions, help people out, collaborate, present ideas, present questions, as all of that. I actually write my results the first draft of my results chapters within Transana. And the reason that I do that is that I have the capacity to put links to my analytic memos, which we didn't have a chance to talk about, but there wasn't time, but also links to particular data elements. So if I find something interesting about that study with pi, I can actually create a link in my write-up. And when I click that link, Transana loads the video underlying that so that I can see the video and understand what I'm saying there. Every time I place a quote in my results chapter, I include a link to the clip that embodies that quote so that I can double check the accuracy of my transcription and of my representation for that quote in my write-up. So I write up my first draft inside of Transana, and obviously at some point I export that and bring it into my word processor and, you know, do all of the additional stuff that one does to move an article from your analytic write-up to actual publication readiness. But I can use Transana and its ability to add links in the text to enhance my writing process. And again, that's particularly nice in collaborative writing because everybody who's reading what I think is important in the results section can load those quotes, play those quotes, and see exactly why I think a particular section is worthy of being included as a quote in one of my articles. So that is at least some of what I was hoping to cover today. I know we covered a lot of ground relatively quickly, but at this point, I'm happy to hang around, answer questions, and demonstrate bits of Transana as long as people want to stay and ask questions. I know that often at this hour point, people need to go, and that's fine. Thank you very much for coming today. But if you have questions, by all means, let me know. I guess the final thing I want to point out is that Transana's website is a tremendous resource that under Learn Transana, there's a huge tutorial that covers everything I've talked about in detail and much more. There are screencasts that are videos that are integrated into the tutorial, but also pulled out separately as screencasts when you're reviewing something. I can't quite remember the steps for creating graphical selections in PDFs. Well, you can go to the screencast and pull that out. There's also the contact form on the website. Transana is complicated software. The qualitative analysis of data is a complicated task that we don't have a shared mental model for. So it's not necessary. That whole concept of intuitive is great for word processors. We can all figure out how stuff ought to work in a word processor. It is less true of something like a qualitative analysis software, because I've seen lots of different ways of implementing things in different software packages, and the whole concept of what is intuitive varies a lot from person to person. So I really encourage people to use the contact form to ask me questions. I try and answer those questions as quickly as I can. And so that is an important part of Transana, is being able to communicate with me and being able to get help when you need it to make the software more useful. So at this point, I'm going to throw things open for questions. Thank you very much for coming. I will send a link around to the recording for anybody who wants to watch that and review what was said in all of this, or rewatch a little more slowly some of the things that I talked about rather quickly. So what questions do people have? So either I explain things so beautifully that everyone understands everything perfectly, or I'm hearing stunned silence.
Hi, David. This is Numa. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, very good. Unfortunately, I think I told you this before, but I had to duck out to go to a very short dentist visit, just as you were getting to the good stuff about Speechmatics, etc. So I will definitely be looking at the video when that becomes available. But I just wanted to comment on some of the other things that you were talking about just in the last 15 minutes or so. All of the stuff that I used to do manually can now be done in one program, and this, I think, has the potential to revolutionize the way that we do CA research. But I do have one question. So you've never talked about this, but it seems to me that if you're, you mentioned that you have a database of 1,600 videos, okay? So let's say that you use the AI-assisted transcription facility in the program, and you get usable words-only transcripts from that. But you haven't talked about the possibilities that this might enable CA research to really expand on recent developments with quantification. Could you please comment on that?
Sure. In terms of quantification, excuse me, I see Transana as a qualitative analysis software, but it also can be a data provider for mixed methods research. So if you create a particular code that represents a particular phenomenon in your research and you're interested in running some statistical analysis or quantitative analysis on those, Transana has the capacity through something called, let's go here. You can choose analytic data export. What analytic data export does is it takes your data elements and particularly the coding that you have applied to those data elements, and it exports them to tab delimited text files that you can pull into spreadsheet programs like Excel or statistical programs like SPSS and SAS and R and all of those different analytic tools. So it converts Transana data into a format that other programs can import and understand, and you can use that Transana data that's reported in analytic data export in those other programs to then go on and do more quantitative type work or mixed methods type work with the data elements that you create.
Right. Well, it's good to know that Transana has that capability. I think I knew that, but I guess what I'm asking you to comment on is more broadly in terms of the potential impact that, first of all, AI-assisted transcription will have on the field in terms of, turning CA into something where the first pass is the in-depth CA analyses or whatever methodology you happen to be using. But this now really does open up, it seems to me, the kind of quantification program that people like John Heritage and Tanya Stivers have been pushing for a long time. But I mean, it opens up huge possibilities in terms of changing CA into a genuinely big data type approach to language and social interaction in general, and that seems to me to be I've not heard you talk about that.
Yeah, I am not specifically a conversation analyst, and I'm not really well versed in some of the subtleties that you're talking about. I would imagine that there's considerable debate in the field about whether CA wants to go big data or not.
Oh, it does now. Yeah.
So what I can say is that I absolutely think that that tools like Transana allow you to mark your data up in particular ways and to look at that markup in particular ways that will make parts of that process much easier. I am actually not a huge supporter of AI at this point in its development. I think,
right.
5 years from now, I think it's going to be amazing. But
Yeah.
right now, I think it facilitates bad science without necessarily facilitating good science. The vast majority of what you get from artificial intelligence programs is actually just plain not that meaningful. It's not particularly accurate. So I am a little hesitant to endorse what AI is going to do for the field just yet, because I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done before it'll be ready for that. But I do think that at some point, those tools will become mature enough where right now, the voice recognition program can produce a reasonably acceptable first draft transcript. So the number I always hear for full-blown Jeffersonian transcription takes about 60 hours to do 1 hour's worth of video in full Jeffersonian notation. And I think that the state of automated transcription right now might be able to shave 3 hours off of that. So you're looking at a 5% improvement.
Really? Okay. Well, that's very interesting. What I use as my sort of conventional wisdom is more like 20 transcription hours to 1 hour of video for Jeffersonian stuff. But but in any case, I was hoping for much bigger increases in terms of time saving. But generally speaking, what I want to say is that I really agree with you, and I particularly like the fact that you have been so careful to highlight the ethical dimensions of using programs like Speechmatics, etc., because discussions that I've seen of whether AI assisted transcription was really feasible. There's a Rossi featured debate in 2015 And I mean, there's absolutely no mention of ethical stuff. So I wanted to commend you for making that a very important part of what you're talking about on the Transana website.
This is not what this is about.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think that that it is important to highlight certain of the ethical considerations as well, because I do think that that's something that that needs to be done carefully, and I'm not sure that it is getting quite the attention that that it needs.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm seeing a couple of questions in the chat. Is there a way in Transana to investigate codes in proximity to other codes? Can you figure out the extent which action coded one happens after the other within the data? At the moment, that is handled through the visual reports. That primarily the way I would approach that sort of proximity or intentionality would be through looking at reports like the keyword map. So you might pick a keyword map, you might limit the number of keywords and visually assess it. So as an example, I have another workup of this same data set from a very different perspective, where I'm actually looking at just 3 of my codes. And in this particular instance, and this is a little bit hard to see because it is drawn out. Let me just zoom in a bit on that. Let's just look at the first 10 minutes instead of the whole thing. And so here you can start to see relationships between these particular codes, and you can start to see how the relationship between the top one is instances of, you go into a game room full of adolescent males and you tell them that you're recording something for data analysis, and you're going to get a certain amount of trying to be inappropriate, shall we say, which is a very gentle term for some very rough language. And it was fascinating to me to see that dynamic going on, and to see another thrust in the group where people were calling them out, either with a very simple forward phrase that I will not repeat, or with different types of saying, you're really being inappropriate here, let's focus on the game instead of just being obnoxious, and to look at the interaction between those who were reacting to being recorded and those who just wanted to play the game and wanted to not mess with it. And so through a graph like this that looks at the coding, you can start to see if there are lots of instances where particular keywords follow other keywords, those kinds of things. But that analysis would be done visually by looking at this kind of pairing. There's not anything automatic in it. There's not the search tool, for example, doesn't have some of the proximity type searches that I know some of the other programs do offer. So that is what Transana does and doesn't support at this point. There's another, I'm sorry, is there a follow-up?
That's really helpful. I was just wondering, can you include multiple episodes that might happen, like video of a class, day 1, day 2, day 3? Could you include multiple episodes in one report like that?
There's actually a set of reports, the library keyword reports, which you run on a library that essentially put all of the episodes in a library into the same visual format for that keyword map type report. So if I'm going to choose the library keyword sequence map, this is the single line display that has certain advantages. But if we turn single line display off, you can now see that for each episode, take a look, for example, at the data collection portion across this. You can see data collection took 50% of the time in the first, got shorter, got too short, and was corrected out to a longer period of time. You see going from a few big blocks to more smaller blocks, which in terms of what this video or what this data represents progress, represents a greater degree of comfort. This was novice counselors getting used to a particular type of intervention, and that the greater segmentation there represents being more comfortable with the way things are supposed to work. You see the red bar showing up, red bar, none of the above, off topic, not doing it, all right, comes in at first and doesn't reappear. You see actually a little bit of sessions getting shorter as the person is more comfortable and the session is more effective. You see greater occurrence of the dark blue band, which is the specific counseling activity. And again, that's something that you're looking for, and you can see across episodes the increase of that. So it's a process of looking at the visual codes of, again, going into the filter dialog to customize what is shown and not shown to make these reports more useful. That will help look across episodes of that. But it's still very much what the program can do is present the graphs, and it's up to the human to figure out if there's any meaning in there, and if so, what it is.
That is very helpful. That's exactly what I needed.
There's another question in the chat. Could I speak a little bit more on the differentiation between codes and categories? Yeah, this is always one of those things that's a little bit difficult to explain because there's a lot of subtlety to it. Essentially, codes are analytic tags that one can apply to the selections one makes. An advantage of codes is that you can apply multiple codes to the same selection. So you can represent a single statement on multiple dimensions, whereas that is more difficult with the process of categorization. Another advantage of codes is that codes are searchable. You can use the search engine to group codes together. Find me all of the data items that have both of these codes so that I can look for the intersection of those two concepts. And so codes are very useful that way. But coding is a little bit more abstract. It's saying this is an example of, you can apply them quickly, you can apply them with a sort of, there's a little bit of analytic thought, but not a lot of analytic thought in terms of what it means. It's more, this is an example of, and I'll figure out what it means later. Categorization is a little bit more deliberative of a process, that when you're making a selection, you by saying where it belongs in your collection structure, you're talking a little bit about how that item fits into your understanding of the data overall, which means that you have to have at least an emerging theory of what the data has to tell you. And the more complex your understanding of the data is, the easier it is to work with categorization. Categorization involves a lot more moving bits around. It's a lot more visual in nature, and that you can look at a set of collections and really see what's most common and what's less common. And so it's a slightly different way of representing the same thing. And again, the collection tells you what is important about that selection, or at least it tells you what is most important about that selection. Working with categorization allows you to look at relationships between items in a way that coding does not. So you can take a set of items and link them together in an order. So you can have an order to items in a category where there's no order to how codes are applied and how they appear in reports when you're looking at coded data. So each of those techniques has slightly different advantages, slightly different ways of thinking about the data or representing the data. That makes a lot of sense. To go into much more detail about that, if you, from the Transana website, go to Learn Transana, the Transana tutorial, and then go into the tutorial that's appropriate for the version that you use. I think professional is probably the most common answer here. You'll actually see a section called preparing for analysis, and there's the analysis overview, and there's coding and categorization. That piece of the tutorial tries to explain some of that in a little bit more detail. In addition, if you look at some of the introductory stuff, particularly the analytic model and the organizational structure, you look at those two bits from the tutorial, that kind of lays the groundwork for categorization and coding by talking about how those pieces fit into the larger model of analysis with Transana. So you'll actually, your best information probably comes from the tutorial, and particularly the coding and categorization section of preparing for analysis in the tutorial. And then the tutorial has the process of making selections divided up into coding and categorization as if they were truly separate activities. My way of thinking about them is that there are different ways of identifying your data initially, but that ultimately by the time you're ready to write things up, you have gone through the process, and you can see that I haven't quite finished this part of the tutorial. Working with codes, it can talk about ways of manipulating coding, working with the common coding tasks as well, but manipulating items in collections is more about categorization. And there's this piece that I'm trying to put together in my head that I haven't really written yet that talks about moving between the two systems, because it's actually, once you have created your selection, the differences from, at least from Transana's point of view, are really, really minimal in that you can code stuff that is categorized, you can categorize stuff that is coded. It's really easy to move between the two systems. And that is pretty much something that you will do in every analysis, no matter which approach you're using, because both approaches are useful. And it's one of those things as well that you kind of have to play with it to be able to really get some of the subtleties. It's not the kind of thing that I can necessarily put out a set of bullet points and you'll say, oh, okay, that makes sense. It's more that you got to play with it, you got to live with it, and you see how some of those differences play out in terms of the way you think, the way you approach data, in terms of your particular methodology, because because the distinctions are really relatively subtle.
Well, thank you so much. It was very, very helpful.
And I think to some extent, I talk about it as I make it sound more important than it actually is in the way that I talk about it. But it's one of those things that it helps if you understand it, because then the whole process of working with collections versus applying codes makes a little bit more sense. I'm trying to make clear some of those distinctions, and maybe I'm overstating the case a little bit. But it's something that I think ultimately it makes Transana a little bit harder to learn at first, but it also makes it much, much more flexible. And I think it's worth the extra effort in terms of, as you move on through the analytic process, some of the strengths of each of those approaches can come through in a variety of ways. And understanding that subtle distinction can help you know how to approach your data to answer the questions you want to answer.
Thanks so much.
Other questions? All right, well, thank you all very much for coming today. It'll take me, excuse me, a few hours to produce and post the video, but I will send out a link in a few hours to the video. Thanks for coming, and as you have questions, by all means, stay in touch and let me know what those questions are, and I will do my best to answer them reasonably quickly.
Thanks once more, David. Very useful.
Yeah, thanks. Really great.
You're quite welcome. Have a good day.
You too.
Thanks, Doctor.